Chapter 7, Politics as the Struggle over Who We Are, on the necessity of building a parallel universe. It follows from everything I have written thus far that politics must involve a new coming into connection that partially dissolves the inertia of our conditioned selves in a newly emergent present moment. In the absence of such a coming into connection, each person seeking to affect the self-constitution of the group through the group's own authorized political process is of necessity a voice crying in the wilderness, because insofar as the authorized political process is a congealment of the collective false self, the process is the wilderness. Like the economic system, the political system is actually the objectified mental picture of the self-creation of our society that results from each person standing in his or her withdrawn space, imagined to be outside the group, looking down or back at the group as a ubiquity of separation and mutual distance. Thus, instead of being here in direct relation to everyone else here, I imagine myself to be out there with all the others as others, a citizen among other citizens in the imaginary unity of a large group of socially constructed entities. Among them, in my case, are Noe Valley, San Francisco, Democratic Party, California, the United States of America. A member of both the state and federal electorate, and so on, until we name all the mentally pictured entities received by each of us in the course of our conditioning. Now, of course, all of these mentally pictured entities have some residue of genuine and live social presence. I am not saying California is a totally imaginary entity inhabited by robots, of which I am one. And I do like California because I feel freer here than I felt in my East Coast childhood. And I like the loose flow and the liberal spirit of the place. The residue of genuine human community and mutuality gives the notion of California a residual political legitimacy for me to honestly say I am a citizen of it. But the mental picture of it, like that associated with the United States of America, is primarily a kind of externally imposed badge that is part of the cement sealing me in my separation. To the degree that being a citizen of the state of California refers me back to my place in the political process, to the extent that I actually stand outside my immediate presence with others and think of myself this way, I unawarely hurtle myself away from being here with others and reflect myself to myself as there in the world of socially separated citizens, as one of the citizens of the state of California. So, we're always here in reality, in each other's presence. But when I think, I'm a citizen of the state of California, we're trying to figure out what that means when I think that. Because I then move out there into kind of an imaginary notion and imagine myself, who is actually here, as out there with the other citizens in the state of California. It's an imaginary structure in which everyone is separated from everyone else, acting as a separated citizen. It is not possible to make social or political change as a citizen of California, so conceived and so pictured, because it is not possible to create presence out of an accumulation of absence. One can inflect the political process, so conceived, to the extent that the residue of genuine human connection remains. We can legalize marijuana this way, for example, which may be a reaching out for a more real and communal world. But the changes so achieved must be limited to changes consistent with remaining pooled up in our mutual distance and separation. And it is possible to transform the meaning of being a Californian altogether, and to radically transform the expressive meaning of citizenship, so that we become a true community of mutual recognition. But this requires a coming into being of a new mutuality of presence that would actually dissolve the political process that we have inherited and place us on a new ontological ground. And while this kind of utopian hermeneutic redemption of received meanings, appealing to a transcendent idea of California or America, are conceivable, as I showed in my discussion in Chapter 4 of Castro's redemption of the meaning of Cuba from its meaning under Batista's dictatorship. Such efforts are subject to the co-optation by the rotation of fear that lurks within them, expressive of their heritage as mental carriers of collective absence, of collective non-presence and mutual distance. Van Jones's campaign to rebuild the American dream is an example of political action that seeks to transform the meaning of an alienated mental image, legitimizing social separation based upon fear of the other, appealing to the image that we all share an American dream of a free society where you can succeed on your own merit and have a house in the suburbs with a white picket fence and become Dr. Welby with your wife and child coming to greet you lovingly after a long day at work. That's the American dream, or a version of it. And Van Jones is trying to transform that into a new image expressive of an actual solidaristic communal world of free and socially connected human beings. When Van Jones says, rebuild the American dream, and he starts a movement to do that, he's trying to redeem the image notion that's actually based on our separation from each other and a fantasy that compensates for that separation. He's trying to seize on that popular notion that everyone has been conditioned to think they're connected to and part of, the American dream, and make it real. That's what his aspiration is. Such an effort at political change, though not doomed to failure, is a high-risk effort because it involves trying to appeal to people by using a familiar, idealized image drawn from the world of the false self. Yet, that residual artificiality itself will tend to dilute and undermine any transformative potential. It is hard to get to heaven by dancing with the devil. It already falsifies the project of creating a new reality to dress it in a false image, in an image that's actually built upon our mutual alienation, the American dream. But the main point for us to grasp is that a transformative politics capable of generating social change requires an emergence into connection with each other through a coming into mutual recognition that dissolves the moat that otherwise separates us and allows us to rotate a new we into being out of what had been our rotating otherness, the patterning of our mutual withdrawnness. The official political narrative that we receive and internalize during the course of our conditioning masks our longing to bring this new and authentic political we into existence by telling us from birth that we already exist in our capacity as citizens of our country, with each of us being one of the citizens. If we recall that acceptance of our false selves as if they were real has been a condition since birth of our very social membership, since we have all been recognized into existence as social beings by becoming, in part, the person recognized by the others who introduced us to the inherited world, we can see that allegiance to the idea that each of us is part of a we, insofar as we are all citizens of the country, is compulsory, simply because it is internalized as if it were real, just as our very selves are, to the extent that they are. Thus, in the collective aspect of life that we call politics, the conflict between the desire for authentic mutual recognition and the rotating denial of that desire is manifested as a conflict between the desire to emerge into a real we and the requirement of deference to the false we. Insofar as my authentic presence is withdrawn into myself, and I experience myself as identified with the relatively hollow personae of my socially authorized self, the false self through which I have been recognized into existence. To that extent, I believe that I am part of the imaginary we that is the American citizenry, which both compensates for and denies my actual withdrawn state. Consider the normal functioning of our democratic process. In reality, to the extent that I'm a withdrawn and socially separated, alienated being, enmeshed in the pathos of my sealed-off everyday life, it is obviously an illusion to say I am in a democracy. To be withdrawn means not existing as fully present in relation to others, means that no true experience of we can occur in my world. And if we are honest, each of us knows that vast amounts of our lives are lived out in the quiet desperation that Thoreau named. In such an environment, we the people cannot really exist because there is no we to be part of in a milieu of mutual distance. Yet the requirement of deference to the false we requires that we all act as though our participation in the we of democracy, of we the people, really does exist. That, as I have said, we were brought into existence, were brought into being by our founding fathers long ago, and that we are still in that community, carrying out their original intent in the collective action of our present political life. Let us examine carefully what we might call the phenomenology of the false we, the lived experience of our conditioning to believe in this false we, by linking two experiences most of us share: the 8th grade civics class and the act of voting in an election. Civics class, in which students are taught the political narrative of what I am calling the false we, could not be taught to very small children, because the formation of the false self remains incomplete until later in childhood, until the adult voice, that constraining voice that psychoanalysis calls the superego, and that the child imagines is above him or her, is firmly installed as part of the self, and serves as the carrier of the symbolic imagery and normative beliefs which foreshorten the horizon of desire and funnel that desire into authorized channels. Prior to that time, we children experience ourselves to a significant extent as here with others, rather than in any official out there where, for example, citizens participate in a democracy and I am one of them. As a result, small children remain significantly in touch with the present moment. They, or we, play together here rather than think about there as if they live there. But by the time the child is 11 or 12, compliance with being for the other within the circle of collective denial allows group activities like civics class, in which children sit quietly and passively in deference to the authority of the teacher and can read about and be told about how we are constituted. I mean, if you talk to a 5-year-old and try to say, you are a citizen of the United States, the 5-year-old will be totally baffled by what on earth you are talking about, because the 5-year-old knows he's right here with you. That's who he is, and we are palpably right here with each other. So you can't tell a 5-year-old that he or she is somewhere else in the United States. Okay. Through the prism of this book, I hope you can experience the internalization of this official political narrative as the taking in of a kind of hallucination. The passive child whose desire for mutuality of presence with others has been decisively subordinated to the role performances of the false self sits removed from any mutuality of presence with the children next to him or her, sits alone in a glass booth of reciprocal separation, and is told the story of the founding fathers and the creation of we the people, and that we live in a democracy in contrast to the others who live in monarchies or under totalitarian states. As I have said earlier, it is of course accurate that an earlier generation in the late 18th century really did exist and really did write up their version of how we should be politically connected and organized. But what I am calling a hallucination here is that a magical gloss is cast over the version of the actual story that gives an idealized or larger-than-life dimension to the story so as to glorify the child's entry into it. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and so forth were not here as everyday beings in relation to others like us, but were founding fathers who met in Independence Hall and signed a document that constituted us and can now be found under glass. Through this idealizing enhancement, the child learns silently something like this: I am doomed to suffer the withdrawnness of my true presence. I am cast underneath the authority of this teacher, the school, my family, the world. But I have another me corresponding to this outer self that they say I am, and that they recognize as me. And there I am one of we the people, touched by a halo of sacred community. From this I gain a sense of idealized substitute connection, although I am painfully unconsciously aware that my imaginary participation in this symbolic tableau also is in the service of the denial of my desire to come into true connection with those around me. That's the child's actual experience. Of course, not known in these words, but this is what the experience is. The child learns that while he or she is not here with others in a true mutuality of presence, or in a relation of I and thou, he or she is at least there in the symbolic tableau as one of the children citizens of the Founding Fathers. Now, to repeat, I must emphasize that I am not saying there is no reality to the historic political narrative that the child learns in civics class, but rather that the narrative is false precisely to the degree that the present reality of the child's lived experience is corroded by an absence of connection to others. The we the people, is lived as a false we, precisely to the degree that the child has come to inhabit a false self by which he or she is divided by an existential moat from the person next to him or her in every room and at every bus stop and in watching television and his or her computer screen, in every situation and moment in which he or she really exists as a living, sentient being. The we of the political narrative is false to the precise degree that the self who imagines it is false, is outer, is disjoined from the desiring center of the child's social being in the living milieu of the child's psycho-spiritual field. So, the child is in the family, playing the role of the child, going to school and playing the part of the student at the school, and then on the bus and learning how to ride the bus, staring blankly straight ahead, and then having some playtime, but then knowing that fits within a larger framework of the living out of these roles as the child gradually develops a more withdrawn sense of his or her real presence, longing for authentic connection with others. To the precise degree that that terrain of the false self becomes the dominant environment within which the child is living and caught up, to that degree the child will come to embrace the substitute reality, the truth and the reality of the substitute reality of the official political narrative. I am a citizen of the United States, I was created by the Founding Fathers, and so forth. Their intent is what matters, and that's what I've learned today is how our country and our society is organized. That is what I'm calling a collective hallucination. To the extent that it carries with it a gloss or a halo beyond the historical events that it purports to be transmitting.
It's like to really understand it, or to be. It's part of the package. Like you can't. It's a ceremonial lesson almost. Like sort of propaganda is the wrong word.
No, it's okay. It's propaganda. It's not intended to be.
Yeah.
People don't know it's propaganda.
Yeah. Like it's not even. It's deeper than that.
It's that's right. It's the collective immersion in social alienation. So then it propagandizes for itself unconsciously in order to keep it in place and not, because otherwise everybody would be vulnerable to humiliation if they suddenly discovered it's part of the denial of the desire for true mutuality of presence and mutual recognition. It's the denial of desire that you get from the person next to you as the person next to you is withdrawn and everybody is enacting their selves, their genders, their way of speaking, their whole, everything that begins to descend on the child as the child grows up and enters into this other world in which I am a citizen of the United States of America, and that world out there that becomes in here in the mind. So now, if we fast forward 10 or 20 or 30 years, to when the child, now an adult, participates in the electoral process on the first Tuesday in November, we can see how the false we of the citizens, of the people, is enacted in the larger political process. Most of the year, each person is enveloped in the patterning of rotating otherness that constitutes our reciprocally withdrawn life. A life always simultaneously punctuated by the desire for genuine mutual recognition that is partially realized in every moment, in and through the mutual alienation that separates us. During the long period between elections, each person, for the most part, does not participate in any political activity because each person is suffering the routines of role passivity in the rotating patternings of daily life. There is no we that can emerge into mutual presence through mutual recognition and that might assert its collective agency in public space. During what we might call this long period of downtime, each person shares in the same imaginary that corresponds to the narrative of the civics class and countless other such transmissions. In the sense that we imagine together that the world we are inhabiting together was and is created by us democratically, while real life corresponds roughly to the world depicted by the great underground cartoonist R. Crumb in his famous comic book Despair. On the cover, the decaying wife says to her decaying husband, "Why bother?" in response to his last-ditch suggestion that they see what's on TV, while inside the comic book, people shuffle in isolation down urban streets lost in sexual fantasies. While real life corresponds roughly to that, at the same time, each person, sealed in his or her routines of separation, imagines we live in the greatest country in the world because it is created by us, by our own free collective political activity. Insofar as we are mainly sealed in the reciprocity of artificial roles that fills up the mold of our false selves, we share the same imaginary of the false we that each false self is imagined to be one of. But on election day, we do engage in a collective political act, the act of voting. We do go out into public, perhaps to a local fire station, and are each separately treated as sovereign individuals as we choose who and what to vote for by touching a computer screen in secret. Yet even here, on this special annual occasion, we normally cannot escape our reciprocal withdrawnness, and we normally do not actually emerge into a real we, because most of the time, voting itself is a privatized, serialized activity. Most of the time, each voter has been conditioned in passivity to choose among candidates who have promised through their own role-based and artificial personae to maintain the rotating patterning as it is, with slight modifications unthreatening to it. Thus, in voting, most of the time, each person remains withdrawn within him or herself, but takes his or her body out to the polling place, and then moves the body, experienced as part of the outer self, through the act, enacting being a citizen in the same way that the newscaster enacts being a newscaster. Remaining withdrawn, each of us goes about our business during the day, to return home later to watch the results, to find out what we decided. This each of us learns by adding up the total number of votes, and the we is then constituted and our decision declared as a mere numerical sum, the sum of our serialized voting enactments. the we established by the election can only be found by totaling up the sum of our outer performances, rather than being experienced as a collective interior truth. Thus, in its alienated aspect, the we that is brought into being by the election forms itself around the isolated individual, but he or she does not enter into it. So you go out to vote. Let's see, am I going to vote for this or that? This one or that one? I go out to vote by myself, go to the polling place. Others are there, usually in silence. No one is speaking to each other. You go alone into the booth, you mark the thing, then you come out. You might stick an I voted sticker on to let others know that you participated in this process. And then you go home, and when everything is added up and the numbers appear on TV, you will know what we did, what we decided. But that we takes place outside of everyone. So no one has experienced we through the process. You only find out about it by adding up what everyone else did, and that's the we. That is the most we get out of the electoral process. I'm not saying it's nothing. I'm saying it's not very much. It's a... Okay, I'll keep going. And yet here again, the description must be decisively qualified by the fact that the desire for mutual recognition overflows the rotation of fear of the other and the mutuality of distance attendant to it. To the extent that particular historical circumstances permit the longing for true community to be manifested in our politics, in part through the act of voting, then the act of voting can become a manifestation of a real we. For example, when Barack Obama was elected president in 2008, his authentic personal presence, the idealism of his narrative about who we are, parenthesis here, in his victory speeches after the primaries, tracing our existence back to the abolitionist movement, up through the labor movement, to the civil rights movement, to the present moment. And also his symbolic incarnation as the first African American person who might get elected, all gave an authentic meaning to his appeal to a we that might emerge from its collective hiding and form into a public mutuality of presence. Unlike the more common abstract appeals of other candidates to inflations of the false we, as in Donald Trump's promise in the 2016 presidential campaign to make America great again, Obama coupled his call for hope with the call, yes, we can, which, in tune with my description, might be better heard with the emphasis on we, as in, yes, we can. And after Obama's victory in 2008, unlike in the case of the normal election, when each of us sits at home and watches the false we come into existence by the gradual summary of numerical totals external to us, after Obama's victory, there was a huge outpouring of joy and tears and a going out into public, signaling the success of our immense effort to win, to make ourselves visible to each other, to risk vulnerability in order to try to recognize each other into a new, more human, more hopeful, more idealistic existence. And by the way, how did we risk vulnerability in that process? Because we carried the hope for a real we into the election itself. And therefore, that was a risk, to actually dare hope we could be incarnated in a certain moment together. And as we'll see in my discussion of the Obama election a bit later. I don't think it's right here. One of the reasons for the rise of the Tea Party, the rise of Donald Trump, for the reaction was that we couldn't follow through on that moment. Whether it was, never mind whose fault it was, Obama's, ours, doesn't matter. We couldn't sustain that degree of vulnerability. That created a huge counter-reaction of a feeling of humiliation at having revealed ourselves so much in our longing, that led to a period of a few years, really several years, in which there was an intense withdrawal from public space, and the forces of reaction congealed in the Tea Party and the other extreme forces that oppose this kind of human vulnerability rose to the surface. There was a huge outpouring of joy and tears, and a going out into public, signaling the success of our immense effort to win, in the real sense, to make ourselves visible to each other, to risk vulnerability in order to try to recognize each other into a new, more human, more hopeful, more idealistic existence. And as I write these words in the winter of 2016, this same pulse has been awakened by the candidacy of Bernie Sanders, a 74-year-old man who might be creating the conditions for a cross-generational group infusion of the 60s generation, carried in the being of himself, with the so-called millennials who are 18 to 29, and as of today are just starting to risk joining this effort to emerge. While Barack Obama was not able, for various reasons, to carry forward for long the incipient real we that he helped to give birth to, or to be more accurate, while we in the real we were ourselves unable to sustain ourselves, in part because we were too dependent on Obama himself. On this point, please see my discussion of this historical hemorrhage in chapters 7 through 11 of Another Way of Seeing, this book right here, my earlier book, in which I show how the inability to sustain the experience of real we led to a gradual dissolution of what the Obama electoral moment in 2008 created or incarnated, in which we were most present through the existing political process. We were most present as a real we to each other, and how that, as we ebbed away from that, the hemorrhage, what I called here a historical hemorrhage of that process, led to pain, withdrawnness, disillusionment. But here, the point of the Obama example is to show that democracy can be a genuine manifestation of we the people, to the extent that an election can overflow what we might call its normal alienated container. If we were able to grasp together that the bringing into being of a mutually recognizing, mutually affirming, loving and caring life world is our objective, or even our sacred evolutionary task, we would not reduce the work of democracy to episodic acts of voting which cannot possibly be adequate to that task. Realizing that such a transcendent aim will involve a politics that works in a sustained way to build the confidence in lived experience that the desire for mutual recognition that exists in each of us exists in all of us, and can be embodied in the practical texture of life. Realizing all that, we will have to create a new, more continuous politics, linking us to our neighbors and local and wider communities in a spiritually uplifting, idealistic way. We might retain voting as a form of mutual declaration. This even seems likely. But our entire political process would obviously not be reduced to the single act of the socially separated secret ballot once a year. Let us recognize the great achievement of prior generations in winning with tremendous effort over hundreds of years our current form of democracy, and in protecting us against fraud and coercion through the creation and legitimation of the secret ballot. That was a great achievement for which many people died. It was a heroic struggle. We can recognize that, and let us now become conscious of the higher level of mutuality of recognition and presence to which we aspire, and let's move forward. Okay, the necessity of building a parallel universe. So that moving forward requires not that we invent a new, more communitarian image of political life, a new mentally pictured model that would appear in its outer aspect to be a more we-constitutive politics, but rather that we co-create in lived experience itself a parallel universe alongside the official political process, whose aim is precisely to establish in lived experience a new ontological ground on which a genuine we can stand. As I showed in my essay, The Social Movement as a Parallel Universe, in chapter 11 of my earlier book, Another Way of Seeing, the upsurge of a liberatory social movement actually constitutes such a parallel universe, insofar as we each, through the mutual recognition permitted by the movement and incarnated in it, become newly present to each other in a kind of radiant circulation of lightness and joy, dissolving the weight of our inherited political identity as citizens, which we have known unconsciously since civics class, has actually sealed us in mutually withdrawn separation, masked by the appearance of having granted to us, since the Enlightenment, freedom and equality. That's the myth. The movement ushers forth a ground of presence here that instantly contests the mutual absence institutionalized in the political process's official other world out there in society. There is nothing there besides my finger. During the 1960s, which, as I have said, achieved its high point as a collective lived experience roughly between 1965 and 1974, and is still not entirely subdued, the rising of the movement brought into collective life a strange doubling within public space, in which the official world, transmitted via our alienated conditioning, coexisted with the liveliness and lightness of the mutually present world being brought into being. We called this world the counterculture because it really did manifest itself as another cultural space, parallel to and coexisting with the received cultural space that was playful, oxygenated, and characterized by discovery and inventiveness, rather than the enactment of scripted routines that is so much the hallmark of conditioned life. A socially transformative politics always requires the creation of such a new ground for social being to stand on, because, as I have said, we cannot make the essential change of becoming mutually present by remaining mutually withdrawn and trying to insert a progressive program into a milieu of reciprocal absence. understood from within the existential psychospiritual framework of the ever-present conflict between the desire for mutual recognition and the inherited fear of the other that is repeatedly on the lookout to contain it, we can see that the creation of such a parallel universe remains a perpetual possibility of each present moment. For as I have suggested throughout this book, no matter how solid the so-called institutions of the society appear to be, they are actually always unstable, mere rotations of alienated patternings of outer behavior, seeking out of fear of humiliation and attachment to the defense of substitute communities of the false self, to maintain themselves as if they were indeed fixed and truly substantial entities. In this respect, our social institutions are, as I have said, like spinning tops, with each actor doing his or her part to keep the top spinning, as the power of desire, its ineluctable longing to burst forth into a plenitude of authentic connection with the person next to us, as that force threatens in each moment to topple it, to topple the institution. Of course, as Michel Foucault in particular has shown, what I am calling the rotating otherness that becomes the social order has developed immensely sophisticated means of stabilizing itself through the creation of disciplinary hierarchies through which the collective monitors itself. For example, the legal system is a vast and dispersed network of government officials, judges, legislators, sheriffs, bailiffs, court reporters, imposing law books that have now been digitized, hallowed buildings called halls of justice, law schools festooned by quotes of the Founding Fathers, law-focused television shows, and the like, all of which are devoted in part to recreating the legitimacy of, and through reification, the necessity of the existing social and cultural institutions. When the judge in his or her robes enters the chamber and everyone rises, it is not only the rotating patterning of otherness in that room that contains the desire of desire and keeps the top of the courtroom spinning, so to speak. It is also the deeply imbued knowledge of every person in the room that all of the other elements of the legal system are out there, adding weight and realness to what is taking place here in the room itself. But what is so important to see and understand is that the manifestations of the law in all of those other instances out there are themselves merely spinning, rotating wherever they are. They are, in empirical fact, never more than people in rooms, reconstituting their part within the legal order, with each person using his or her inflection of gesture to keep the legal top spinning and aright. In a very real sense, the entire majestic legal order, the law itself, is a vast and elaborate acting out of the emperor's clothes story, to the extent that its social power is sustained only by people's belief in it, which belief is itself sustained by the commitment of each legal actor to act as though the order is real, is actually there. But as occurred in the story of the emperor's clothes, and has actually occurred throughout history when transformative social change has begun to become possible, the top can start to really wobble and threaten to fall over altogether when the present moment begins to become infused with the possibility of an outbreak of authentic mutual recognition and presence. And this can only occur when it does occur in the present moment itself. So there's a footnote to this paragraph that I just read of the legal order being a kind of spinning top that is keeping itself going by the appearance, the sort of sanctification of the appearance of everything that's happening as if it were real, with knowledge that it's happening in all the other courtrooms and everywhere, so that it seems as though there's no escape from believing in the reality of the law. And this footnote is to that paragraph. There have been many examples of successful efforts by activist lawyers and their clients to break through the ritual choreography of the courtroom as a way of countering the way that these rituals elicit obedience and passivity, not only in the courtroom itself, but across the entire social field that the law seems to govern. The best known in my lifetime was the Chicago 7 trial, originally the Chicago 8 until defendant Bobby Seale's trial was severed from the others. That Chicago 7 trial occurred in response to the protests against the Vietnam War that took place outside the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968. Mayor Richard Daley famously permitted the Chicago police to very violently put down the protests, and then 8 so-called ringleaders were selected for prosecution, including well-known 60s activists Tom Hayden, Abbie Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, and Bobby Seale, whose trial ultimately was separated from the others. The defendants and their lawyers, William Kunstler and Lenny Weinglass, refused to obey Judge Julius Hoffman and disrupted the ritual in various ways, among them Abbie Hoffman cartwheeling into the courtroom and giving alt answers to standard questions. For example, when asked, "Where do you reside?" Abbie replied, "I live in Woodstock Nation. It is a nation of alienated young people. We carry it around with us as a state of mind in the same way as the Sioux Indians carried the Sioux Nation around with them. It is a nation dedicated to cooperation versus competition, to the idea that people should have better means of exchange than property or money, that there should be some other basis for human interaction." That was his answer to "Where do you reside?" The judge then interrupted him and told him to just say where the place is that he resides. Paul Harris and I have analyzed the significance of this trial in undermining nationwide support for the Vietnam War itself in our article, Building Power and Breaking Images, Critical Legal Theory and the Practice of Law, published in the New York Review of Law and Social Change in 1982. Our main point was that the challenge to the ritual form itself weakened the power relations through which the entire rotational edifice of power relations supporting the war was legalized and legitimized. In the trial, the prosecutors were trying to enforce the perception that the defendants had simply crossed state lines to incite a riot, which is what they were charged with. And Judge Hoffman, too, was attempting to use his authority as robed choreographer of the proceeding to make sure the trial was perceived through that lens, whether the defendants were found guilty or not. But the defendants and the lawyers were trying to topple that spinning top altogether and put the Vietnam War itself on trial to reestablish that the protests had not been a riot and had immense moral support from the entire country. Disestablishing and delegitimating the courtroom dynamic, reported nightly on national television, was central to transforming the perceptual field within which the war itself and national obedience to the coordinators and justifiers of the war were viewed. If the Chicago 7 defendants could emerge from their hooligan status and establish themselves as moral agents of a great morally inspired movement, the hierarchical, image-saturated arena of the courtroom might partially dissolve, and along with it, the larger hierarchical network that was conducting the war itself. So, the whole way the defense conducted itself in that case was to try to, in a way, nudge over or knock over the spinning top that was maintaining the legitimacy of the courtroom itself and the law and following the law and following orders and following what everyone said about the Vietnam War and the spread of communism and the domino theory, and we have to be doing this. And as they attempted to dissolve that room on national television, you could feel the dissolution of support for the war and the automatic belief that we must be going to war to follow the theories of the people who were creating the war, with 3 million Asians dead, 55,000 Americans coming home in coffins draped with American flags. So they were trying to create a parallel universe in the courtroom to the universe that the judge was trying to enforce as an institution. And it showed that the courtroom was just an enactment drama, not a real thing, and therefore that it could be cracked and dissolved and suddenly brought down to the level that the defendants and the lawyers were trying to make heard. And it wasn't just nihilism and attacking the court that they were doing. They were standing up for the moral significance of the protests at the Democratic Convention. The moral significance of the anti-war movement is what they were carrying into the courtroom, while the judges and Judge Hoffman and everyone else participating in Roll were trying to say, these defendants are charged with crossing state lines to incite a riot. They are hooligans. And if it was limited to that, the defendants instinctively understood that they would lose whether they won or they lost the case. So they found not guilty of being a hooligan. That's not the same as saying, I am, in fact, a carrier of the moral opposition to the entire Vietnam War, which is what our protest was really about. So they had to bring that into the courtroom in part by dissolving the choreography and the melodrama of the room, which was trying to represent itself as a real thing that couldn't be challenged because it was the law. And this is how we do the law. And as that began to crack, that was the creation of a parallel universe right there in that room that made the counterculture felt as something that could challenge the dominant culture. And if it could happen in that room, it could happen outside the room. The first moment of the creation of what I am calling a parallel universe of social being arises when someone, potentially anyone, engages in an action which de-reifies the pseudo-concrete, meaning which challenges the apparent realness of the existing order, and at the same time, in that very act, affirms the realness of another way of being, which acts in its social aspect as an appeal to the other, to potentially any other who experiences it, to recognize this realness also. Consider the very famous example of Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama. In one respect, it is of course true and important that Rosa Parks was engaging in civil disobedience of the local ordinance requiring blacks to sit in the back of the bus. But in another very important sense, this action also denied the realness of the bus seating rules, not just their legality. Whereas in the prior moment, the moment before Rosa refused to move, whereas in the prior moment, the white establishment of Montgomery was able to rely upon the reification of the collective perceptual field in which blacks simply sat in the colored section as a matter of fact, as if this perceptual field were a two-dimensional surface without depth. Once Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, she revealed that the prior fact was merely possible, that indeed the entire bus as a traveling vehicle might not have any preordained cultural order at all. Parks's action could only have this meaning because all of the other acts of nonviolent civil disobedience that had preceded it had opened up a new possible space, as yet not fully revealed before Parks's action, that made her able to tilt the collective perceptual field by her refusal to move, made it possible for her to introduce into the social field the notion that the colored section might not be a fact, and by extension that all such racial segregation might also not be the way things are. Were it not for all the prior acts of civil disobedience, protest, transcendent spiritual oratory, gospel singing, and the like, Parks's refusal to move would not have had the same power to reveal the contingent or merely possible nature of the rules, because she would have been summarily arrested in accordance with the seating rules that the collective environment, according to its long-conditioned legacy, would have continued to perceive as fixed, as real. In the instance of her actual refusal, she was, of course, summarily arrested, just as she would have been without the prior seeding of the context. But properly prepared for, her action helped decisively to crack open the frame so that the existence of the colored section could appear arbitrary and the arrest appear unjust, or better, absurd. Seen as an example of building a parallel universe, we must understand Rosa Parks in this situation as having been intuitively ready, by her grasp of the entire social context of the Montgomery bus boycott and the civil rights movement as a whole, in which she had been and was continuing to be a participant, to spontaneously refuse to move. And while it is true that this refusal was an act of courage, it is better understood in its social aspect as an intentional appeal to everyone else to now, in this present moment, join her in seeing the existence of the colored section as an arbitrary social construction rather than a fixed aspect of the bus. Of course, the white establishment of Montgomery would resist this alteration of perception by doing all that it could to close the space thus opened by its own appeal to the law. But when I say Parks was appealing to everyone else, what I mean is that she was appealing to the social field as a whole, with all its constituent elements pro and con, to shift its overall allegiance away from the passively endured facticity of the existence of the colored section of seats to a new perceptual universe that would dissolve this facticity. A new perception ushered into existence ontologically by a new and more real we emerging within it. It is this new and more real we that is the parallel universe, an autonomous self-constitution of transformative group presence, emerging from a ricochet of mutual recognition that takes back what Heidegger called the worldhood of the world, and regrounds collective perception and collective meaning on its own truly human, truly interhuman terms. So, if we start with no social movement, no civil rights movement, everybody takes for granted blacks sit in the colored section, and that the colored section is real. There's the white section and there's the color section, and that's just a fact about the bus. And that everyone accepts this fact. And then we have the rising up of the social movement, of the civil rights movement over many, many years, supported by all the factors that I spoke to, the oratory of Martin Luther King, the vision creation of Martin Luther King, the beauty of gospel singing in the churches, the poetic quality of the movement expressing itself. A new ground is created inside the alienated environment, and that new ground is creating the basis for a new space on which people could stand and see one another. And as that builds over a period of years, when Rosa Parks refuses to move, and of course the white establishment tries to enforce the law, which says that is the colored section, but the movement force is saying there's no such thing as the colored section. It's all a hallucination, an imaginary, crazy aspect of the alienated world that has created this. And so when she refuses to move, supported by this parallel universe of the civil rights movement itself, supported by that behind her, suddenly it's what she's doing is she's appealing now to everyone to say, choose the ground of the civil rights movement. Give up your allegiance to the supposed truth of these sections on the bus that actually are imaginary and don't exist. And though she couldn't have done that earlier and had this effect, here an act like that can burst forth because people who have felt the truth of the rising civil rights movement and been influenced by it and drawn to its presence and reality, people scattered throughout the culture, Rosa is intuiting, I can do this. I can refuse to give up my seat, and when I am arrested and some people come and drag me off the bus, many, many, many other people will be rising around me and support and decide to stand on the new ground, which is better, truer, more human, more fulfilling for every person who agrees with me. A part of themselves then is coming out and declaring, I want to be in a real, loving, caring, connected world, not in a world in which I'm an isolated, withdrawn person going through my roles, looking out at a fixed world in which whites and blacks are automatically in a hierarchical relation of separation. So, it's that in the spontaneity of her act is the intuitive decision that I'm ready to not give up my seat in a way that could create change and dissolve the bus as this fixed entity with its fixed seating sections. Okay. As the movement develops, the capacity to create such moments of transformation, or perhaps better, transfiguration, becomes more and more widely shared as the we of the movement grows surer of its foothold in existence. Recalling my own participation in the movements of the 1960s, I can think at random of a very large number of such moments rich with symbolic and creative force. Abby Hoffman leading a levitation of the Pentagon during a large anti-war protest. Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir inspiring a whole generation to refuse to enter into the frame of holy matrimony, although marriage may also have a redemptive, transcendent aspect. The Chicago 7 defendants refusing to obey the courtroom rules of Judge Julius Hoffman in order to delegitimize the charges that the anti-war protests against the Vietnam War held outside the Democratic Convention in 1968 were the actions of hooligans who had crossed state lines with the intent to start a riot. The decision by one and then a few and then many women to stop wearing bras and shaving their underarms, the growing of long hair by men, the explosion of hitchhiking, and so on. And while it may seem trivializing to mention such examples in the same breath as Rosa Parks' challenge to racial segregation, the point I am making is that the accelerating, rotation of all these actions really were bringing into being a new community by virtue of their character as appeals to one another to come out from the system of conditioned roles that had been containing us and to give birth to the moving force, to what we call the movement, which is nothing else than this morally compelling, moving force of creation, community, and truth. The truth of this moving force is precisely its rotating, ricocheting affirmation of the mutuality of presence to each other that, because of our inherited conditioning, we had been in denial of without knowing it. And it was this collective becoming present that allowed us to make social and political change, because this transfiguration of being, perception, and world was the change, in the sense that the action of Rosa Parks, when she refused to give up her seat, and her action became confirmed by others through mutual recognition of its truth and realness, was the dissolution of the racial distinctions in bus seating that subsequently generated the verbal change of the law as a result of her successful incarnation of it in that creative present moment. Thus, the parallel universe is the ontological vehicle that makes manifest the incarnation of the new world, constituted and then inhabited by a real we, as it makes an incursion into the psycho-spiritual field of the false we and contests it for political legitimacy. What I am calling politics in this chapter on politics is the work of bringing into being this real we precisely by contesting the false we that the collective false self, the alienated matrix of the conditioned world, defines as politics. Just as the false self reasserts its fear of the other by claiming in meta-silence that it is the real self, that it is what is, so the false we asserts that it is the real we, and that its collective expression in political life is a genuine expression of what the people want. When a movement of genuine mutual recognition arises, altering the perceptual field as I have described, and introducing into that field a new psycho-spiritual vitality and spreading radiance, it has not won, but rather has only begun to engage the fear of the other that still exerts itself with great force against the liberatory opening that the desire for mutual recognition has managed to create for itself, for all of man and womankind. Through the movement, the real we is able to form itself and make itself manifest by breaking out of its prior pooled up condition through a ricochet of confidence. We might say it manages to momentarily outwit the fear that previously had been containing it with such constant vigilance, and that had been externalized in the hierarchy and internalized in the underneath self. When we're pooled up and isolated, we're also underneath the world. In our separate withdrawn spaces, casting up our conditioning and our false selves. And that's what I mean by the underneath self. That's when we're inhabiting things from a fearful spot without being fully conscious of it. And once the real we enters public space with sufficient confidence, through the rotation of mutuality of presence, for us to experience that a parallel universe comprised of a plenitude of connection, exists alongside the artificial, hollow universe of absence of the false we, we do have a place to stand that is a source of spontaneous relief and joy. But as quickly as this parallel universe emerges, the artificial universe tries to reassert itself and dissolve it, initially through overt opposition. Everything longed for in the parallel universe is against the law. And then eventually through co-optation. What you long for can be accommodated by the law. And on the side of the false we is nothing less than the weight of history, which in the present moment is simply the accumulated transmission of the normalization of fear of the other in all its forms, modified by the poignancy of all prior efforts of the desire for mutual recognition to make itself heard. We all know that we long for more, for a present reality that would realize our desire and transfigure our fallen state. But we know it mainly through the medium of fear's long, successful containment of that longing, as that has been transmitted to us as the real world. And you can see this poignancy, this element of commitment to tragedy in a way, that's part of people saying, be realistic. Be realistic means everyone else is going to enforce upon us an inevitability of our isolation. So don't hope for too much. Be realistic is a poignant acceptance of the tragedy of the necessity of being withdrawn and isolated, which, of course, is what we have to overcome, just exactly that. So when Rosa Parks dissolves the racial classification of correct bus seating, the civil rights movement, whose ricochet has made her act possible, must then seek to change the law, which is to say that the movement must continue following the moment of revelation to enter into a dialogue with the false we, so as to make the dissolution of racial segregation binding on the false we. Obviously, this is a paradox, for while the moral appeal of the real we being carried forward by the civil rights movement emerges precisely from that movement's authenticity as the carrier in this moment of the desire for mutual recognition, and while that moral appeal, because of its basis in truth, is irresistible in the sense that it cannot, if sufficiently supported by the movement's parallel universe, continue to be denied by the false we, in such a way as to allow the false we to continue to be credible to itself. It's so palpable, the strength of the movement, when it reaches that height, that the false we can't deny it, but has to accommodate it. It nonetheless remains true that the false we and its fear of the other still holds sway over the world as a whole, and still has all the resources of its long and heavy weight of history to call upon. The false we says this to the real we. Okay, we cannot any longer deny that segregated bus seating is wrong, is absurd. But to make this binding on us, you must change the law, and in that symbolic and verbal arena, we will reassemble our forces of fear and seek to recharacterize your momentary revelation in accordance with our hegemony, in accordance with the overall requirement of maintaining security against humiliation in the face of our fear of the other. Thus, while Rosa Parks' action in 1955 did lead, along with the ricochet of and accumulation of other such actions, to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that banned discrimination in public accommodations like buses. The disalienating meaning of Parks's action was given an alienation-restoring meaning in the legislation and its subsequent interpretation. To see how this transposition of meaning occurred in this instance and occurs in law generally, we need only locate ourselves inside what we might call the Rosa Parks moment and contrast the meaning of that moment with the worldview and consequent meaning of the Civil Rights Act and of anti-discrimination law generally. Parks's act was a transformation of a present moment in which the moral truth of true equality was incarnated and made manifest. We could say that in refusing to give up her seat, she broke through the network of images that the instant before was spiritually imprisoning her and the entire alienated world within which she and the bus driver and the other passengers were all located. That was the world inhabited by withdrawn beings, separated from each other by their mutual alienation, and participating in the settled imaginary communities of whiteness and blackness, of imaginary racial differentiation that substituted for authentic community, and also served to protect those withdrawn beings against each other, against the threat of mutual vulnerability and possible humiliation. We could say that at a deep, even unconscious level, everyone understood that the racial differentiation in seating and racial differentiation itself was absurd and imaginary. But they could not allow themselves to know this consciously due to the necessity of sealing themselves in their roles in accordance with their conditioning. When Parks refused to give up her seat, she declared invalid and imaginary this entire alienated matrix, and supported by the real we of the civil rights movement behind her, she was able to both reveal the alienated matrix, to make the alienation itself conscious in everyone, and also to bring a moment of true mutual recognition into the world. Suddenly, the withdrawn actors in this drama were pulled out of their withdrawn state, pulled out of their heads in which they were identifying with their false selves, and in the white section with their imaginary whiteness, and they were forced to become present to each other and actually see each other in the present moment. That concrete incarnation of mutual recognition of their social equality, or better, of their common humanity, is what gave to Parks's act its moral power, a power that, because of the power of the real we behind it, the false we could no longer succeed in denying. But now please notice what I am calling the transposition of meaning that took place when almost 10 years later the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, prohibiting racial discrimination in public accommodations like buses. Certainly, the authentic egalitarian meaning of Parks's act, as incarnation of true mutual recognition of our common humanity, had not been forgotten in the culture by 1964. In fact, it had in many ways been strengthened by subsequent similar acts of resistance, by demonstrations, by the morally compelling oratory of Martin Luther King Jr., by the development and radiant influence of the civil rights movement itself as a continuing and developing moral force. But when Parks's action was codified in the law, the meaning of her action was also turned over to legislators and to judges who would later interpret the law, and who were, for the most part, although not exclusively, still identifying with their roles as representatives of the state and spokespeople for the wider society, for the false we. Many of these legislators and judges were also undoubtedly influenced by Rosa Parks and by the civil rights movement as a whole, and were also themselves pulled toward revealing their own desire for mutual recognition and for true community by the force of the movement as a parallel universe, by its pull upon them. But insofar as these legal actors were also attached to their roles as makers and interpreters of the law, they also remained attached to their valued position in the existing society. And insofar as they were removed from the moral energy of the movement, they remained loyal to their false selves and the false we of their own historical conditioning. So when they together stated by verbal declaration of the law that discrimination in bus seating is prohibited, they did not see the mutual recognition of our common humanity that Parks brought into existence in that concrete moment, but rather they saw a bus of disconnected monads, of mutually withdrawn passengers, each in their roles, and they declared that their seating arrangement could no longer be racially differentiated. In other words, they restored to the bus its alienated character that had been broken through for a moment when Rosa wouldn't give up her seat. They restored to the bus its alienated character, but added to all the other relevant rules, the rule banning discrimination based on race. To the extent that these lawmakers and interpreters remain far enough removed from the pull of the movement upon their real longings, as mere human beings seeking loving eye contact with all other human beings, to that extent they remained, to that extent of their being removed from that pull, they remained withdrawn into themselves, and so perceived the world that they were legalizing across a moat, as a world of the withdrawn, rather than as co-inhabitants of the world of mutuality that Parks had in her moment of resistance, and in conjunction with all the other externalizations of authentic being comprising her movement itself, brought into existence. In subsequent years, many legal doctrines were employed by the Supreme Court to acknowledge the illegitimacy of discrimination based upon race. But all of them have sought to reconcile the prohibition against discrimination with what I am calling the false we, with a mental picture of the community of the nation and its political morality as expressed through law that makes non-discrimination consistent with remaining withdrawn within the patterning of rotating otherness that constitutes the concrete lived experience of alienated life. To the extent that, for example, affirmative action retained the morally transcendent meaning in its early years of King's vision and Parks's action, to the extent that it signified a vast effort on the part of the real we and the rising community of true mutual recognition to acknowledge and heal the legacy of slavery, to that extent the legal doctrine of affirmative action carried forward the movement's aspiration to social transformation. But as that doctrine was gradually absorbed into an imago of the socially separated world of the withdrawn selves, the doctrine was increasingly interpreted to mean that insular minorities who had been subject to discrimination in the past could get a bump up in the market-driven competition to make it as socially separated individuals in an anonymous and anti-communal American society. And as I have shown elsewhere, see the spiritual meaning of social justice in another way of seeing, and my earlier the meaning of affirmative action, making it as individuals in the competitive marketplace or climbing together to the mountaintop in the bank teller, this gradual shift to make affirmative action consistent with the false we inevitably reinforced image-based ideologies like meritocracy and the legitimacy of vested rights, and produced new binding legal doctrines like impermissible reverse discrimination against deserving whites that further cemented the marriage of anti-discrimination law to the reification of the false we. The civil rights movement's exertion of authentic, loving mutuality against the pathologies of the system of social separation continues to be felt within the culture as an echo and a kind of subterranean reservoir of hope, not wholly extinguished, not merely for a world beyond racism, but for a humane communal world generally. But that echo and that hope has been reconciled with, and therefore subordinated to, the restoration of mutual distance and separation. One might say that this process reached its apotheosis in the election of Barack Obama, as a black man was able to become president of a formerly all-white enclave, but could not stand for more than being a black president at the top of the false we's political hierarchy, still carrying forward the echo of Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, but predominantly being enveloped within and speaking for the false we that has retained its predominantly alienated, mutually withdrawn character. So, think about what the meaning of Obama's presidency was. He did break through, he did carry with him that liberalizing hope that we could see one another as fully human. And he embodied that in quite a beautiful way in many ways. But basically, he had to do it within a sphere, at least he felt he did, and he accommodated himself to it, as within a sphere that of being the President of the United States, on top of the hierarchy of all the other institutions that are continuing to function just as they've always functioned, except that they had a black president that carried an echo of those prior liberatory movements that made his election possible. Yet, my characterization thus far of the struggle between the real we and the false we may be misunderstood from this entire description, to refer to two separate forces within the culture, one brought into being by the movement and one aligned against that movement on the side of alienation. The movement as a parallel universe is an indispensable origin of transformative collective politics, and through its realization of the desire for mutual recognition, it does give birth to a new social reality of human connection on an ontologically independent ground, in effect rescuing the dispersed and withdrawn relational beings that we were from our mutual spiritual imprisonment. We come into existence by rising up and then standing together in a new space when we can suddenly discover and see each other. But we do this within the psycho-spiritual field of the false we that had enveloped us. And so the movement actually introduces into that field its own transcendent presence as a spreading call upon the conscience of the we as a whole. This we as a whole is therefore best understood as a unitary, moving or rotating relational field inhabiting a unitary social space It is a single psycho-spiritual field, with the false vector in that space actually constituting no more than a continual, mutually reinforcing resistance to the pull of desire within the unitary field, a kind of mutual appeal by each person to the other not to give in to the desire that calls upon the relational field itself from within itself. In a way, the false self tells itself not to let down its guard as it feels inside itself the pull, the potential pull of a truer movement being born and community being born, which of course threatens everyone in their vulnerability. That's why one way to look at the last 40 years is people affected by the movements of the 1960s take the leadership. All the same age: George Bush Jr., Bill Clinton, Newt Gingrich. I'm just referring to stick figures in a way who are visible as in the political leadership of the country, who you can see in them the aspect that was drawn to what the 60s aspired to, that's visible in some of Bill Clinton's qualities, and the powerful rejection of the threat of that energy that is visible in those who were totally opposed to it, like Newt Gingrich or George Bush, largely opposed to it. All the same age, all went through the same experience. In fact, there was one famous speech by Marilyn Quayle, the wife of the vice presidential candidate Dan Quayle, in 1988 at the Republican convention, when she took to the platform and devoted herself to denouncing the 1960s as having introduced all these terrible things into the culture. You could see that beneath all the policy debates of the moment, underlying it was this complex feeling about something that had pulled on everyone to be part of something higher and better and more beautiful and more loving. It was terrifying also to others who felt in danger of being betrayed, ripped off, humiliated, put down, threatened with the loss of all the artificial forms of collective inherited identity that could be undermined by the pull that they themselves felt within themselves and had to stamp down. So, thus the rotation of collective resistance that is the false we has as its top priority convincing itself that it is real, and through that mutuality of hardened conviction, warding off the temptation to succumb to the desire and longing within. Because human reality is at all times relational, my sense of the balance of the real and false within the we as a whole, decisively influenced by the totality of my past experience of this balance, will determine what I am capable of transmitting from my pole in the relational fabric to the others around me, and whether I feel I can or cannot call upon the person next to me and all the others with whom I am in contact to come out from behind the personae, the anonymous false selves who appear to believe in the false we that separates us. It's always a question for all of us. Can we appeal to the person next to us in the next moment to come out and be with us, connect with us? We are here together. Do we dare? Do we dare to do that? Well, that depends on our whole historical relationship to this force. The hermit crab peeking its head out of the shell, except that we are doing that in every second of our lives. We're always trying to find that expressive voice, and the extent to which we feel we can do it depends on how much we've been strengthened by the historical support for that integrity of our deepest longings, and that has helped to give us the confidence that deepest longing also exists in the other person right next to you, the person at the coffee shop, the students in your class, every place we are. To see how the balance of the real and false occurs as a political balancing act, always tipping toward a breakout of the real that the false is always struggling to contain, or better, to infinitely postpone. Consider the present moment in American politics. February 29th, 2016. The day before Super Tuesday, during the primaries leading up to the 2016 presidential election. So that's when I wrote the following description of that moment. On this day, as I write these words, the Democratic primary is a contest between Bernie Sanders, mainly representing the real we, and Hillary Clinton, mainly representing the false we. This contest is taking place, and by the way, maybe I should say, I have a long footnote here, I could read that, but explaining what I mean by that. Maybe I will read it, so I don't alienate any listeners. I have retained this description as it was written in the present moment on Super Tuesday, or the day before Super Tuesday, during the 2016 run for the Democratic nomination, precisely in order to capture how the effort to create a real we contests the pressure to maintain the false we within social consciousness, within a living present moment. In that moment, as I experienced it, I did believe that Bernie Sanders represented and spoke for an emergent, authentic community, and that Hillary Clinton mainly represented and spoke for maintaining the world as it is, subject to ameliorating liberal reforms. As I make clear in Chapter 8, this claim on my part is but an appeal to you to recognize the trenchancy of my description, which of course you are free to do or not to do, or to do so subject to your modifications. I voted for Hillary Clinton in the general election. End of footnote.
Can I ask the trenchancy? Is that...
A trenchancy means how good the description is, how compelling it is.
I see. So if you understand your point, you'll dig it or not, basically.
Right.
I dig it.
Okay.
I think it's exactly how I felt too.
All right. So it just
it's hard to take.
Some people freak out about that.
Yes, understood.
That's why I voted for Hillary Clinton in general.
Yes. No, because you almost have to
specify. This contest is taking place. So this was now in the present moment, February 29, 2016, that I wrote these words. This contest is taking place within a largely demobilized atmosphere, characteristic of American culture at this historical moment. By that I mean that we are not currently, as a community, under the influence of a breakout of mutuality like the 1960s, but are living within what we fairly call normal routines, more or less regulated by an apparent universal, or at least hegemonic, commitment to the ascendancy of the false we. If we were living within, experiencing, or constituting the breakout of such a movement of real mutuality of presence, the election would have a different meaning, because we would be everywhere constituting ourselves as a real we from here, from our own existential space, being rotated into existence by each of us in relation to the other. But in today's historical moment, such a force field of authentic reciprocity does not exist. And so hope for the we as a whole is projected out onto the tableau of the presidential candidates within the hegemony of the false we. We each hope we can use the election as it takes place out there to leverage ourselves out of our mutual separation toward the realization of our common desire. And we have reason to hope this because we feel we have no other access to each other within the we as a whole, since each of us is sealed within our mutual distance as citizens. And because as citizens, we can each rely on the agreement within separation that we will all declare by the act of voting tomorrow whether the real we is ready to overcome the fear of the other sufficiently to confirm itself as real in public. The leverage that we as a real we might gain from the election is that we might be able to declare that we exist as a political community laying claim to the character of social reality, to the we as a whole, in a way that will, if successful, increase our confidence that the other is ready to go with us out from behind our respective shells. If Bernie Sanders wins Minnesota, Massachusetts, Colorado, Oklahoma, and Vermont tomorrow, Tuesday, March 1st, or if he does well enough, whatever that means, within the balance of the real and false in this moment, the real we will be able to go forward to the next step in the next moment toward a more general emergence into a movement for mutuality of presence, for a loving community. Again, this is all what was true at this moment as I lived it on February 29th, 2016. Now, I have called Bernie Sanders the candidate of the real we because he manifests himself as a real presence rather than an artificial one, because he is running on a campaign of we are all in it together, embodied in a series of actual programs that ground the authenticity of that call, and because he has said directly in an evocative and beautiful way that he believes we each feel the suffering of each other, that all human beings do, and that if we stand together, there is nothing we cannot do. As a witness participant in this actual moment, I experience the authenticity of Bernie's call. I feel the burn, to use today's vernacular, that really does capture this call of conscience that has rotated Bernie Sanders into existence, and that Bernie himself has been publicly transmitting in his being an expressive discourse through his campaign. And I experience the artificiality of Hillary Clinton, who has taken over some of Bernie's words without the presence, to add enough borrowed reality to her own campaign to make her call to maintain the false we appear real in the face of Bernie's real threat. Hillary is making her appeal from within her persona of public speaker leader-to-be as the candidate of realism who will not dismantle the false we, but build upon it by incorporating Bernie's real elements within it. And she will be president of the new false we, the first moment to occupy this high office on top of the hierarchy, just as Barack Obama was the first African-American person to do so. I have no intention here of discounting the possible movement forward that Obama's presidency and Hillary's possible presidency represent. They do represent a partial empowerment of their respective subordinated communities, just as they also, by contrast, represent a partial co-optation of the respective social movements that made them possible. But my point here is simply to accurately characterize the present moment on this day within the presidential primary season, as we call it, so as to show how the real we and the false we coexist in the struggle within the we as a whole. The significance of this day is that the relative realness of the we as a whole is being contested on this day because of the leveraging potential for the real we of this series of Democratic presidential primaries taking place tomorrow. In other words, we're at that moment. It's a different moment now in the anti-Trump resistance years, completely different. Would call for a different essay of describing the phenomenological existential reality of the present moment. In that moment, tomorrow's the primary, right? And the question, and the real we, as it was bubbling up, in part validated and confirmed by the Sanders candidacy at that moment. It isn't. We weren't already in relation to each other as I and thou in direct relations of community. We only had the Bernie's campaign to symbolically be connected to each other. So the opportunity of the election is to see if we could how much our real we could reach into the we as a whole that constitutes the society. How much could we reach into it? The opportunity provided by Super Tuesday, March 1st, the next day, was can we leverage ourselves through this voting process into public visibility, into existence, to get that much more of an incremental step forward toward really being able to become present. That is, to really actually being present in the here, in the moment. That at this moment when I was writing this, we were still, each of us in our separate apartments and houses, projecting out, seeing if we could use that moment tomorrow to get that much closer to suddenly bursting out of our separate apartments into each other's existential company, you might say. So as I sit here at my desk, back to February 29th now, like 2016, as I sit here at my desk, I am still passing through my normal routine, carrying out the activities of an average 69-year-old man existing under the canopy of the false we, existing my world within its few block neighborhood, in a rotating patterning of average mutual distance. As I say, this world is not currently mobilized in creative mutuality, but rather I pass my fellow neighbors on the street, say hi to those whom I know, project a pleasant demeanor within the constraints of the available role performances. I can't really appear grim or overjoyed without absurdly tilting the rotation within which I am recognized. So I stay within the norm of how you pass people on the street. Considering what I'm saying in this book, I certainly pour as much of my desire for mutual recognition as I can into these passing encounters. I do actually look at those whom I pass in the average milieu of what I have earlier called aversive presence. But I am entirely constrained by the rotation itself, by the routinization of what someone of my age and class and race, all cultural artifices of the false self legacy, what I can do within those conditions of how I'm perceived and what I must carry, and how I can be. And from within that relatively constrained, relatively conditioned patterning, I am daring to hope that Bernie Sanders does well tomorrow in the states that I listed. However, the very inertia of my own neighborhood here in liberal San Francisco is partly intensified by the fact that although Bernie won New Hampshire by a landslide, he has since lost Nevada by a little and South Carolina by a lot. Since Hillary Clinton's call is to accept reality and vote for the false we, as she wins in these early primaries, her victories mean that the immense advantage that the hegemony of the false we starts with within the we as a whole may well be strengthening or increasing in weight. My own vulnerability to being humiliated by hoping we might decide to extend ourselves toward each other, a hope, as I had been hoping by the large crowds Sanders had been drawing, and by his more than 4 million small donations, and by the surprise big victory in New Hampshire. My vulnerability to being humiliated is heightened today as I feel the inertia that Hillary's recent victories and most recent poll numbers affect the dynamic in my own neighborhood, affect the step of each other with whom I come into contact, including Clinton supporters who have with unconscious resignation decided that Sanders is not a realistic candidate, although they like what he stands for, meaning they would like to hope if they could, but they feel they can't because of what they believe resignedly everyone else within the we as a whole will do. And if and when I turn on the news, as we call it, the weight of the false we upon me will become that much greater, because the newscaster, as I have earlier shown in discussing his or her persona, his or her presentation of self, is on the side of the false we and wishes to present its reality as inevitable, as real. When the media that is mainly mediating the false we to itself, that's what the media is doing. It's mediating the false we to itself. When the media predicts the inevitability of a Clinton sweep and that she now has the nomination within her grasp, I cannot but know that a certain number of college students in Minnesota and Massachusetts will be less likely to remember to vote, as they instantly sense with their youthful, still relatively unsubdued life force that perhaps politics isn't for them after all, and shift to thinking about going out dancing. In fact, I am hesitating to turn on that news broadcast because I know that it will hurt me to do so. I'm willing to still hope for a Sanders victory or good enough showing, but I'm not willing to expose myself too much to the humiliation of being once again thrown under the bus of the newscaster's smiling, relentless persona, that false self manifesting itself as real and claiming to speak neutrally as a journalist for the state of the we, as a matter of fact. Now, I offer this very partial description, this phenomenology of the present moment, to show how politics actually unfolds as a struggle between the false we seeking to maintain itself as if it were who we actually are, and the real we seeking to make itself manifest in the context of an election in which the we as a whole declares itself by the collective act of voting. If Bernie Sanders were doing better, meaning that those students in Minnesota and Massachusetts were going to be declaring themselves as open aspirants to a world of human connection tomorrow on Super Tuesday, I might be feeling and behaving quite differently. I might be making an extra trip or two to my local coffee house to see who is there to talk with me about our momentum. But instead, I am exactly where I am, daring to hope as much as my anticipation of rejection by the other can tolerate, along with millions of others like me, in a historical moment decisively conditioned by the overall balance of the false and the real within the group, and with the very limited but not insignificant opportunity for leverage offered by the electoral process within a relatively demobilized milieu. Further, although my description of this present moment may seem almost silly in its detail, for example, discussing whether I will go down to the coffee house or not, etc., I have left out a vast number of other phenomenological factors relevant to the precise situation of the balance of the we as a whole, including the refusal so far by African Americans in the South to respond to the call of Bernie Sanders, and the decision by many women to support Hillary Clinton because of the redemptive hope that they attach to a woman becoming the first leader of the we, or if you prefer, our president, even though they sense her tilt toward reinforcing the congealed false we that otherwise spiritually imprisons them as universal social beings. A full description of a single moment in the struggle over who we are, particularly a moment in which this question is explicitly contested in the limited way that elections establish the we as a whole's reflection of itself, would require many pages. The point here is simply to present to you a glimpse or a snapshot of this struggle as it actually occurs in the concreteness of social existence through the experience of each person attempting, as I must here at my desk, to totalize the entire psycho-spiritual field and gauge his or her willingness to reveal his or her desire for mutual recognition, as that desire confronts what Sartre called its, quote, coefficient of adversity, unquote, the fear of the other that rotates a patterning of otherness trying to resist the threat of vulnerability. The point is that the false and real coexist in the political sphere exactly as they do in every two-person interaction, with the former, that is the false, seeking to deny the pull of desire through the regulation of me here and them out there, and desire itself seeking from every pole to break past its regulatory constraint. Beyond reform or revolution. Once we can see politics as a struggle between the real we and the false we, within a unitary we as a whole, engaged in an interior collective conflict with itself, we can also see that the debate within the left about whether to seek social change through reform or revolution must be superseded. To once again quote my friend Duncan Kennedy, speaking to a group of critical legal studies activists in the early 1980s, quote, "It's not about reform or revolution, it's about making the kettle boil." The traditional reform versus revolution debate proceeds from a standpoint that tries to be outside society, looking at the world from an outside position, and debating whether the right approach to change is to change it piece by piece or to try to fundamentally reorganize it as a totality. Like most social thought, this traditional approach treats a living, breathing, radiating, constricting, experiential, interhuman life world as if it could be known and changed from the outside, like the alteration of a physical object. From an architectural standpoint, it is possible to debate and decide whether it is better to remodel a house or knock it down and build a new one, at least to the extent that a house is in fact an objective entity that can be looked at and analyzed externally with the help of architectural plans. But the social world can only be grasped from the inside as a collective lived experience at odds with itself. Making the kettle boil, as Duncan put it, means seeking to create experiences which allow a we of mutual recognition to emerge from a we of mutual distance, role performances, social beings at arm's length, effortfully separating themselves from each other by a moat that protects them against the humiliation portended they fear by the pulsion of their own desire, their own longing for the reciprocated vulnerability of mutual recognition. As we have seen from the revolutions of the left in the last century, making a revolution understood as a seizure of state power, nationalization of the economy, or any other such fundamental external reordering does not assure the creation of a society that fosters authentic human community, because such a communal world, in which each person can recognize and fully experience the other as a thou, and so be experienced by the other, must be spread into being through building confidence in each other's desire. In part, this requires breakthrough experiences that are captured metaphorically by the idea of revolution, moments in which social movement becomes possible in bursts. People suddenly become present to each other, and the force of that coming out toward mutuality gains the traction to ricochet across the face of the social landscape, as occurred in the 1960s. But in part, and here prior social movements, including the 60s, have fallen short, the successful communalization of the world also requires healing from the fear-saturated legacy of alienation that has been passed on generation to generation and has been internalized by every one of us. Such a social healing requires a spiritual politics that builds upon the breakthrough power of the movement and that allows our mutual confidence in each other's desire for mutual recognition to sustain itself in the face of a fear of rejection and humiliation that inevitably accompanies it. As I showed in my essay, How the Left Was Lost, a eulogy for the 60s, in Chapter 6 of The Bank Teller, a mere revolution must produce a powerful counter-reaction to the extent that it connotes an instantaneous reorganization of the we as a whole, because it is not possible to instantaneously transform the real social relations that are mobilized in the revolutionary moment. Breakthroughs of mutuality are always thrilling, but building sustained confidence in each other's here-ness or presence for each of us is more difficult. Although the idea of reform in the traditional sense has always been contradictory, in the sense that it is not possible to co-create a real we while maintaining the dominance and fixity and legitimacy of the larger frame of the false we, the metaphor of reform does aim toward the more sustained work of overcoming our fear of each other and building confidence in each other over time, which that contrasts with the revolutionary metaphor. Thus, within capitalist society, socially progressive reforms like universal health care can establish patterns of collective care for each other and each other's families that reflect back to us our sustained connection in a way that a revolutionary moment of breakthrough cannot. To the extent that an external reform, like providing universal health care, is accompanied by spiritual cultural practices that foster social healing, including the healing of our bodies, that reform may help the real we to gradually emerge and gain a foothold in the we as a whole, as a kind of marker of our continuing presence for each other. But without the creation of a spiritual practice that creates and sustains the actual transmission of the care in universal health care, a reform like universal health care may tend to congeal back into a bureaucracy of the false we, a collectivization without soul that is consistent with maintaining the wish to remain withdrawn, and in which care becomes the mere insurance of separated and externalized thing bodies. Thus, a spiritual politics actually requires both revolution and reform, as those words are re-understood from the inside. In its revolutionary aspect, a transformative politics requires decisive breakthroughs of authentic mutual recognition that reveal the fear-saturated artificiality of the false world masquerading as real. Bursts of revelation that gain the traction to ricochet our real we into existence and to gain a foothold in the we as a whole. In this revolutionary aspect, the desire for mutual recognition emerges and spreads through the we as a whole with sufficient force and radiant ubiquity so as to challenge the entire framework of the false we and bring, for example, the entire rotating patterning of otherness that is capitalism into question. In its reform aspect, a transformative spiritual politics requires a sustained spreading of confidence within the fabric of this real we being born through progressive social changes that retain their soul, that retained their enlivened sense of authentic human connection and solidarity. When universal health care means making manifest actually caring about each other's health, vitality, and well-being, as opposed to merely ensuring externalized and ontologically separated bodies against illness and injury, then it advances the effort to sustain a real we beyond the revolutionary breakthrough that allows that we to be born. We can therefore outline the building blocks of a transformative politics as follows. Inspire into being incursions into the false we of authentic human connection that make us aware of each other's presence and simultaneously dissolve the appearances to which we had been attached that separate us. Build out of the movement of such a real we being born a parallel universe that provides a ground for us to continue to stand on beyond the breakthrough moment. Support reforms that sustain our mutuality of presence to each other over time with sufficient attention to the psycho-spiritual liveliness of the reforms to infuse them with their transformative meaning and purpose as building blocks of a new world, and continue to generate revolutionary experiences of mutuality of presence that can in turn support new sustaining forms that allow that presence to be reflected back to itself in a way that strengthens our own confidence that the desire for mutual recognition within each of us exists and will continue to exist over time within all of us. That's the end of that chapter.
Wow.
All right.
So that's a recipe at the end.
Yeah, it's a short recipe, and then there's a lot more in chapter 10.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Wow. Good day. Good
Okay,
start.
chapter 7's in the can.
Beautiful.